Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of our live show, Action Items on Let's Talk Supply Chain, sponsored by New Gen Architects. Good morning for me, maybe good evening, good afternoon from wherever you are joining us in the world. Leave a comment, let us know where you're joining from. This is definitely going to be an interactive session, so if you hear something that you want some clarification on, you have questions about, definitely leave a comment. If we're not able to get to it in the show today, we will get to it later. We will be going through the comments and responding to people. So here on Action Items, we are talking supply chain transformation. And again, this is brought to you by New Gen Architects, supply chain transformation done right. A new generation of solution and business architects bridging the gap between business and technology to help companies achieve successful supply chain transformation. As a thought partner and facilitator, the NGA team sets up clients with a secure foundation and layer in ownership as we work with technology tool selection, project management, business transformation, road mapping. The NGA team is made up of industry change makers whose goal is to support scalable and efficient supply chain transformation. So visit newgenarchitects.com for more information and to schedule a discovery session with a member of the team. So what we are doing here in Action Items is really getting into the nitty-gritty details as much as we can in our short 45 minutes. But we want to give people, spoiler alert, action items that you can actually take away and execute at your jobs related to supply chain transformations. Right now, there's a lot of talk of, we've seen the last couple of years, a really big push for digital. We've got a big push for upskilling and reskilling talent to understand what that looks like, what their role is going to be. But there's so much that needs to be done. We've got all of these ERP upgrades, WMS, TMS, warehouse automation, planning, sales and operation planning. There's just so much going on. So where do you start? What can you actually do? We hear so much of, the content. We have a lot of great content in the industry right now. And we're talking about a lot of topics that we need to discuss as practitioners. But what are those few things that you can start doing now to start on your journey? So this week, we're going to be talking about all of that from a risk management, contingency planning, business continuity perspective. I personally have my little notebook here. I'm going to be ready to take notes because this topic came to mind for me as I was doing some research and some prep for a client as they are implementing a tool. And we've been doing a lot of firefighting. And I was thinking, a lot of these issues and a lot of the fires that we're trying to put out seem like we should have known about them already. They're known risks. We knew that it could have happened. So what happened with the contingency planning? Who dropped the ball? Who was supposed to have the ownership? And I found what I thought was going to be a really, really nice, robust article from McKinsey. And it was really short. We all love short articles. I love when I see the minutes to read and it's 5 minutes or less. I was like, oh my goodness, this is going to be great. So I took some notes and, they were all of these highlights of identify your known and unknown risks, manage your known risks, build a supply chain risk management framework, monitor the risk, institute governance plan, and build a risk-aware culture. And I was like, great, I'm going to do all of that this week. That's a multi-year plan, especially when we're talking about building a risk-aware culture. Anything that is going into the culture, into the vein, into the blood, the skeleton of the company takes time. So I thought, who better to ask than Adeleke, who we have, and we are going to bring him up now to our live stream. But who better to ask about this than the risk management? I mean, when I go through my LinkedIn feed, I am like, let me save this post, go back and read it later. Save this post, go back and read it later. So much good content from a risk management perspective, especially in the context of the global supply chain framework. I mean, if you need to know something, this is your guy. So I want to get into some conversation with you, Bio, on just, what can people do? Again, I mean, cool, I've got this list of stuff, but where do I actually start? Who owns it, especially in the context of everything else I'm doing with my supply chain transformation journey? Where does this fit in? How do I make sure that as I'm implementing my ERP, as I'm implementing this new inventory management tool, as I'm implementing any end-to-end supply chain tool, how do I get it going? Where do I start?
Good morning, good afternoon, and Dyci, thank you for having me, and congratulations on your podcast. And I'm excited and actually privileged and honored to be your first guest. I was like, of all everyone in this world, I'm the one you picked. I really do appreciate it. So, as you've rightfully said, it's quite interesting when it comes to supply chain risk management. It's always an afterthought, and I've made mention of it over the last few weeks that 2020 and 2021 is a year of supply chain. Over the course of time, we've always whined and kind of criticized different business functions why supply chain is not centerpiece. But this particular year, and I think COVID in the backdrop actually gave us a full dose of why supply chain is quite important, from babies to almost everyone in the world knowing what supply chain management is. Unfortunately, risk management in the context of supply chain is quite expensive. It's very expensive and very vast kind of stuff. I mean, we'll talk about it, we'll write it theoretically, but in oftentimes when it gets to the executional part of it, it's very, very complex and expensive. Especially if we have multiple products coming out from different parts of the world, which one should I actually kind of take over? But for small and mid-sized businesses, it's quite challenging for them because when it comes to supply chain risk management, it's very disproportionate. How do you manage this? How do you manage that? They don't have the structure, they don't have the processes, they don't have they don't have the money like the big dogs, as we call them. So how do they actually navigate through this? But regardless of whatever structure you have, either small business, mid-sized business, or large, right, there are certain things that you have to actually play into consideration. First of all, in real sense of supply chain risk management, because if you look at everyone, ask anyone within an organization, everyone always look at risk management in their own siloic form. I'm in finance. This is what I look at. I look at it from this perspective. I mean, business development, I look at risk from that perspective. There are several layers of risk. When it comes to supply chain management, I think the same thing applies. But risk management across the board has to be everybody's business. It's not somebody's assigned a risk. No, it is everybody's business. At the moment you actually institute that part of your corporate culture, it solves majority of the problem. Everybody must be in tune to risk, which now brings me to the next point. Most organizations, especially in the small business and mid-size, do not have a risk culture. And in the risk culture whereby everybody is now risk manager, in the risk culture, everybody can identify risk from a janitor to the CEO. Everybody has seen anything that is quite and they believe that can be quite, detrimental or be a parasite to the organization. Everybody should be able to identify it. But in my course of consulting, I realized that during pandemic, a lot of people do not even understand what risk plays in their supply chain. And that is very, very quite alarming. So one thing I will put out there, apart from, understanding, the risk, the risk culture, the risk appetite, is understanding the risk within the supply chain. So hear me out. When you go to an hospital, right, the first thing you do when you go to an ER, the doctor or the nurses, or they'll do triage. They'll do a triage to figure out the symptoms and whatever the what's causing whatever you are having, right? The same thing.
I don't know where this is going, but
Yes.
doctors triage, I like it. So I'm following.
So when you go to the hospital, they'll look at the symptoms, they ask for the symptoms, right? You see the symptoms. In supply chain, you see the symptoms, but that is too late then. So you have to go to the root cause of it. So the same thing when you're consulting, especially in the area of supply chain risk management, you look at all these things happening, like how is this happening, right? And then you realize that you have to treat the symptoms first to kind of alleviate the pain, and then you work your way back to the root cause. That's what most doctors do, unless, I mean, any doctor in the house can correct me, but that's what really happens. You have a headache, they'll first solve the headache first to figure out what's really causing your headache, right? But the same thing in supply chain, you kind of triage your supply chain, and you can only do that, at least from my perspective. There are multiple ways to do that, but the most effective way for both big organizations and small businesses is by mapping your supply chain. You look at who is actually touching your supply chain, who are the stakeholders within your supply chain. You'll be surprised. In several companies, both the small and mid-sized business, they don't even know who is touching their supply chain. I was asking a company here in Dallas, like, who is the second and third tier supplier? Are they from what part of the world? It's like, I know that we don't have anybody from China. I said, are you sure? He was like, yeah, that was during the heart of the pandemic. And then we dug into mapping the supply chain. I'll figure out actually the first layer, the first tier supplier actually is from China, which kind of impeded most of its supply. So, and that's what
It's
most.
so funny. I'm just to interrupt. I mean, I've got to get this story out of my mind.
Yeah.
I remember when I started working with a very, very smart guy. I will save name, or what is it? Keep the name to save the innocent. But I remember he told me, he said, yeah, don't ever take anybody's word for it, because it's never true. And, it's something that, when we come into, and working with clients and customers like that, and you say, are you sure? Sometimes they get a little offended, you know what I mean? But it's not us trying to push back and say, you have no idea what you're talking about, but it's us recognizing what you just said, all of those layers. There are so many layers. There are so many different pieces of the supply chain of product operations. And especially in those small and medium businesses, those small and medium enterprises where they don't have all of the resources, the time, the people, the capacity, the dollars to really map that out. It's understandable and expected that you don't know where everything is coming from. You haven't taken the time to map it out, or the last time you mapped it out was 2 or 3 years ago. And since then, so much has changed, because in addition to getting started, it's a maintenance. Like you said, it's got to be part of the culture to where everyone knows and everyone's keeping up with it. So interruption, tangent, back to your story. He found out that there was actually a tier 1 supplier in China.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, in God we trust, everybody else will verify. It's just the way, I mean, that's one of the common saying, everybody else, I'm sorry, but I'm not saying I'm not trusting you, but I have to verify the information you just gave me so that, I can be ascertained. So in the process, we find out that this particular individual company, have their first tier supplier is actually from China. So, and then we have to work the stuff back. So now after you kind of map out everyone within your supply chain, then you can actually overlay it with possible risk. As you said, from McKinsey, editorial that you wrote, that you read rather, that, you have to understand your.
I write for McKinsey all the time.
Yeah. you have to understand your known and unknown risk. So this is how you kind of look at where are your single point of failures within your mapping? Where can I?
Now that sounds like it could take a long time. That sounds like if I'm like, okay, my known and unknown risks. My known risks, I think, are this, and I have read a couple of articles in, I would say, maybe last week. One particularly stands out in my mind, from the ASCM CEO, supply chain. Let's celebrate the wins. As an industry, we actually did a really good job, at least from the perspective of the US. The media was saying that there were going to be so many stock outs and that Christmas gifts weren't going to get to people. But for the most part, especially if you are comparing it to, the complete stock out. Where are my gifts going to be? I mean, I know we personally didn't get, an iPad, but if you look at the whole of, all consumers, purchases were up. As an industry, the CEO was commending everyone on the collaboration. But in my mind, that's kind of like, that was a known risk, but that was a known big event. So if I think about, people that have warehouses or fulfillment centers in Tornado Alley, when it's tornado season, they are prepping well before because they know tornado season is going to happen. When hurricane season is coming and you're in Florida, you're prepping well ahead of time because something's going to happen. Everybody knew that there was going to be a big possibility of, stock outs and product, with all the logistics issues, with the container issues, with the port issues. Like, these were all known that people were, they were big. They were going to have huge impacts to the business. But I feel like a lot of times those known risks that are not the huge events get swept under the rug, or for whatever reason, it's like, oh, we'll figure it out when it happens. And I'm thinking, very specifically always from that technology implementation perspective of like, oh, well, yeah, we kind of knew it was going to happen, but it's like, yeah, but now we're spending weeks trying to resolve this issue with Excel workarounds, et cetera, when we probably could have just taken an additional 30 minutes, in the initial project planning. But yes, you're not losing money because consumers can't buy products, but isn't it also detrimental to the business if you can quantify the amount of time that a person is spending to resolve this issue that we knew could have happened, that actually had a pretty, significant likelihood of happening. And we can take their salary, put that on ours, and then determine the actual dollar impact that it's having. And in my mind, just saying it, it's like, okay, why didn't we do that? But you said that's time consuming. That's expensive. But how expensive is it on the back end to not do it? Is my question.
And I'll paint a different picture here. It is quite expensive. But what I'm saying, in essence, when I meant it was quite expensive is, for example, you only mentioned one singular event, right? Imagine you're in a company, you have multiple staff, right? You have to be able to decide, because you cannot, in good conscience, you cannot monitor supply chain for, especially if you have multiple products coming out of your organization, or you receive multiple products. You have to figure out, where is my lifeline? Which one is my critical path? Which one is my critical equipment or my critical product? That if I don't secure this particular, if I don't manage this particular risk, or supply chain risk for this particular product, my company, my organization is going to go down the drain. And I think that's why I will always advise the mid-sized and small businesses. Fine, you cannot go after every product that you go for. I mean, largely because it's quite impossible. It's very expensive. Imagine you spend so much on this. See, on the known risk is very easy, because honestly, I believe the known risk are quite easy, because there's historical data. There is so much information out there that you can actually prepare yourself for it. And unfortunately, people, like I said, the risk appetite, the risk culture, which we talk about in the beginning, that's why you actually alluded to it. Like, this is going to happen. If this thing is not properly taken care of now, down the road, if you keep kicking the can down the road, and then you realize that, oh my God, it's too late, and then it becomes quite expensive for you. Those kind of risk is just because folks do not have risk management framework within the organization. That's why they'll be able to do that. But in a real organization whereby you take risk as a part of your core competence with the organization, no, that's not what happen. Immediately you identify the risk, there is a particular plan to actually assess, mitigate, transfer, or whatever you want to do to that risk immediately. But unfortunately, like the example you just made, it's just being lackadaisical, and actually people, whoever make that such decision, they should take their money for it, actually. Because if you know that this thing is going to become detrimental to the organization or to the product down the road, then why don't you actually implement a plan at the beginning? But again, the supply, I mean, small and mid-sized businesses, they don't have those kind of luxury. They just have to make determination. Now, we live in a world of decentralized supply chain. A small business in America can actually call on a supplier in China or in Dubai, to get their stuff. Those days of linear traditional supply chain is long gone. With the advent of technology, so much technology, right? We're now in Web 3.0 and all these things. A lot of decentralization is going on, which means a lot of more risk. We'll talk about it when we get to that, visibility and transferability and all those kind of stuff about how small businesses can actually key into those kind of problems. So mapping your supply chain, overlaying it, looking at your single point of failure and your vulnerability point. Those are things you can actually do. But here's the kicker. COVID came out from nowhere. Nobody saw it coming. I mean, some people say they saw it, but anyways, somebody, nobody saw it coming. So
that's another show.
Another show. But the thing is, if you actually have a solid supply chain risk management framework, it doesn't matter if you know the risk or not. It matters that your supply chain can withstand it. It can stretch it. It can stretch it in such a way that it kind of put a lot of pressure on it. And we've seen a lot of supply chains during this pandemic that was stretched. But the good part is because they have a supply chain framework, supply chain risk management framework, they were able to contract it back. It works regardless of whatever happened, regardless of whatever the risk is coming from, it will always work. But what we saw is that a lot of folks do not have supply chain framework in place. So instead of things stretching, it broke the damn chain. And that is what exactly. So supply chain risk management framework is supposed to provide you a safety net. If everything else fails, at least you'll be able to survive. A lot of organizations survive this. Now, a lot of organizations.
Quick question.
Right.
How do we, because especially with the known risks, and you talked about getting that plan and understanding how to respond to those risks. So there's a lot of times where I sit in on meetings. This is what senior leadership, the nature of the work we do, because it does end up having to be like that culture change. It is, end-to-end product operations. It touches, like you said, finance and, so many different points of the business. So the people that we're regularly talking to, we're senior leadership. We're at the C-suite, we're SVPs of insert, department here. And I sit in on these conversations, sometimes it's just facilitator, note taker, where can I hear some insights that maybe I can make some recommendations as a thought partner. And I hear the CFO, the VP of operations, the CEO, I hear them very often say, well, what if this happens? So like, we know, it's there. There is this wherewithal. There's this situational awareness. Well, what if this happens? And what I notice is someone says an answer and then that's the end of it. It doesn't go anywhere after that. Yeah. And part of that, at least from what I've seen, especially in the context of those small, medium businesses, is that you only have so many people. Yeah. And especially right now, like you said, there was COVID that no one was expecting. There are still policy change, like public policy changes, labor shortage. Like there's just so much. So people are like, okay, how do I just keep the lights on right now? And, I always encourage people, I get it. I know you want to just keep moving, but we've got to take a step. We've got to take a breath. We've got to take a beat. Whatever you just said, what if? Someone's got to own a contingency plan. Someone's got to own, okay, we talked about it in this meeting, but how do we now funnel that information down so that everybody is a risk manager, like you told us at the beginning of the show, so that everybody knows what we just said. What if X happens? Then I always envision it in, you're watching like an action movie and it's like, execute plan, whatever, like you hit the button. And it's like, okay, so how do we encourage people, to take that beat? And I don't want this only from like the consultant perspective. I mean, we're doing this show for practitioners. We're doing this show for people to go back to their teams and be able to have some insights, to feel confident to say, this is what we need to do, guys. How do we encourage people? What are the words that they need to say, okay, cool. What if X, this is the plan that you just said, Mrs. SVP. All right, I'm going to build that out, and then we'll circle back, approve it, and then determine how to communicate it down to all the teams. I feel like that's maybe a big gap that we're missing.
Exactly. In big organizations, they have what they call risk councils, whereby everybody comes in there, they do all these what ifs, right? But in small and mid-sized businesses, they don't have that luxury to have risk council. So this is what really happens. This is what I always advise them. Every task you take, there's always supposed to be a risk assessment to it. It's just the way of the world. It's very painful, but the moment you actually implement it, it's part of your supply chain risk management framework. You have a risk assessment. So I want to move this particular product from here, from point A to point B. What are the possible risks that we can encounter on the way? Or driver driving over 70 hours, busted tires, not meeting the timelines. All these things, right, can be actually being listed. And it can be done individually within the small organization. It doesn't take a risk council to do it. And small businesses should be able to do that. When I used to run a trucking company, I used to be able to do that as well. So if you're moving the stuff, every task that we're moving, every movement, every lanes that we're moving, we can possibly anticipate the risks that can happen as long as we know the route, the cops on the road, busted tires. If there's a busted tire, where is the nearest thing you can, go different mile markers, do we have, all these things can easily be done. So I always, when I talk to small business, I always found it interesting, especially in logistical organizations, warehousing, trucking, and talking about all these risks. I'm like, you guys can easily do it because I've done it before. It's about understanding. It's a very painful process, but the moment you integrate such processes into your way of doing business, it makes life easy. So your every lane that you run, especially let's use just a logistical transportation company as an example. Every lane that you run, from a driver from picking up the load to delivering the load to the point of destination, you can actually anticipate the risk along the way. Is it being pulled over, busted tires, engine problems, what to do? So as long as, how do I make sure that I still make up the time of delivery? All those things can be done because that's the simplest form of how to assess your supply chain, actually from a small business perspective. So understanding it is about risk assessment, to be honest with you, assessing the risk. What you just said about you being a facilitator in some of these meetings, like what the person said, what if happens, right? And somebody answered it. Normally, that should have been taken care of when talking about risk councils. Every tax that comes over there, you assess it. Is it how am I going to mitigate it? Am I going to transfer it? Am I going to eliminate it? Or am I just going to manage it or transfer it, depending on, you got to look at whatever the risk is and how you're going to mitigate it and, make sure that it's taken care of. So like, again, the small business and mid-size, you don't have the resources for it. But as a business owner, you can actually do this because that's the only thing that's going to keep the lights on. Ability to be able to assess the risk and look at what's the best mitigating strategy for it. Again, you might not have the risk council, you might not have the large, robust supply chain risk management framework like big companies do, but you can actually do this in a microscopic way, in a small form that actually every task you do within your organization, assess it. I want to buy stuff from China. All right. How is it going to happen? What if this happens? What if there's a delay? How am I going to move my stuff from? I'm only assessing from China today. Can I get the same particular product somewhere else that is not from China? Is it going to be expensive? Yes. How am I going to get the cost reduction for my customers? I can't do that. I will let them know ahead of time. Like, look, we do not have it from our regular supplier, but these are the genuine suppliers. Their communication plan.
Not just internal.
Exactly. External as well.
Suppliers, your 3PL partner.
Exactly. So these are some of the mitigating strategies that we can put in place for small businesses and mid-sized businesses alike, for them to be able to be on par with their big dogs counterpart, so that they don't run them out of business. Because the world we live in today has changed. Small business over here don't even rely on suppliers within the United States. They go as far to the far end of the world to get whatever they need to make their business sustainable. But when they do that as well, they're also feeding themselves to the sharks. The sharks of geopolitical issues going on out in the world, sourcing from areas that don't even have a clue of what cultural influences affect their movement of goods and services. So all these things have to put into place. So you SME, you're over there right now, you're sourcing for something from Kyrgyzstan. and then Kazakhstan rather, and then you realize that, oh my God, you watch the news, wow, what is going on in Kazakhstan? How are you going to mitigate it? It's too late then. But by then you should be actually looking at the trend of the last 6 months, what has been going on over there, especially if your lifeline of your company comes from that part of the world. Start looking at it, because oftentimes, we don't do that a lot. We just believe everything is certain. But the world we live in today, at least if COVID teaches us anything, is that we live in a very, very uncertain world, and we have to take extra precautions. That means we have to, double check and triple check. So, for example, uh, small businesses are like that. They don't have the risk council. They don't have robust framework. You take the matter into your hand. Everything you do, you have to do a risk assessment. Everything you do from point A to point B, every possible, because if you can think of it, it might will probably will happen. If you can think of it, or probably has happened to somebody before, it probably will happen. Things you can't think of, then there is nothing for the much you can do. You just kind of react to it, especially for small business, unfortunately. But things you can think of, if you can think of it, it will happen.
Yeah. And it's also a couple of things that were coming to mind. So New Gen Architects is new, year two, year two. And we've been doing this. We, as in, me, have been doing this. So it is something that small businesses can do. That's my point of it, not to toot my own horn, but it's something that small businesses can do. In our case, I am the risk counsel, but I'm working through it with legal, and it was from the perspective of business continuity. You've got to keep the business going. So what happens if there is this? What happens if there is that? And just you can mention known risks. We haven't gotten to the unknown risks, but just from like a known perspective, there is something that we can do even with our tiny little team of 10 to 15 people. So I say that to say it sounds daunting, but it can be done. And then also, I know we have a couple more minutes before we've got to go into our action items and our takeaways for this week. But one of the other things that I was thinking of, as you were talking, you can, like, if you Google risk register or risk assessment, there are tons of templates to, just get you started. It's not something that you have to start from scratch from doing. And the other thing that I was thinking is, how do you avoid analysis paralysis? Because you can get into, oh, this can happen, this can happen, this can happen. And especially from a small, medium business perspective, I have an answer in my mind. I'm interested to know what your answer is.
So I was once told by a great mentor to avoid action paralysis. I think, if I remember well, the information has to be relevant, has to be timely, and it has to be able to be make decision out of. If those information doesn't fit those criteria, is useless. It's to prevent action paralysis, and that's I'm like, wow, I think I actually, you know what? Let me make sure I'll put it down. I'll put it. I think I have it written down here. I'm even shocked that even you asked me this question, because it's always one of those things I always read on. Oftentimes you have all these witty notes over the course of time.
Nuggets.
Exactly. Exactly that. Over the course of time that we haven't really, actually. Let me read it out. Okay, I have it written down here. It said the information has to be accurate, relevant, reliable, timely, and useful for decision. Those are the 5 criteria. So I actually I was writing an article about 5 years ago, and I asked him, because I remember I only mentioned about 3. So I remember there are 2 more. So I texted him and, oh, you remember this? I said, yes, I did. So and those are the 5 criteria. The information has to be accurate, it has to be relevant, it has to be reliable, it has to be timely and useful for decision. The same thing goes for risk as well. If those things doesn't meet those 5 criteria, you're about to enter the information paralysis area. And is a very nasty hole you don't want to get in there. So that's my answer to that.
I've got one last question, and I know we've got to give these golden nuggets, whatever we want to call them, to everybody. But we've been talking about things that we can do, and we're going to, go into now a quick wrap up so that everyone get out your notebooks and be ready to take these, 4 to 5 points down. But before we talk about that, what's the level of effort? And this is a personal question that everything I do, I say, what's the level of effort? So when you're thinking small, medium business, and I know the real answer is it depends. It depends on how large the organization is. It depends on the starting point. It depends on, resource capacity, et cetera, et cetera. But just ballparking it, when you sat down and you mapped out, or when you sit down, because you've done it many times, you map out the network. What does that look like from a time perspective? Is it something that you do? You take all the information, you do it? Is it something that you guide the team and facilitate the team doing? Is it 2 weeks? Is it 3 weeks? Is it 6 months? What are we thinking from a level of effort perspective? What can people expect?
Awesome. So I'm going to answer that real quick. I know there's a time crunch over here. I read this book by Gary Lynch. It's the godfather of supply chain risk management. The book is called Single Point of Failure. One of the laws that he mentioned there is law number 9, if I remember correctly, that if supply chain risk management is not part of the solution, it will become the problem. And it's as factual as it could be. If it's not part of the solution, it's going to be part of the problem. So for me, I don't look at it as at the time, and it's a 2-part answer to it. It depends on how much you trust.
It depends. I knew you were going to say that. It depends.
It depends on how much you trust your team. If your team is your lifeline and you trust their decision-making process, then you can walk the team through it. But if this particular task at hand is so heavy that you don't them, that you rather do it yourself, then you can do it yourself. But for the most part, I don't, is the number 1 thing I do, and is the only thing I do when I do supply chain risk management framework or assessment, is regardless of how much it takes me, because the sooner I can get it done, the sooner I can actually unravel whatever problem is going on. So for me, it is the only thing I actually concentrate my time on. And the level of effort is all in, either small task or big task. I commit the same amount of time to it, because it's like thing in the military, from my military background, is regardless of the task, either big or small, you commit the same level of effort to it. As long as you do that, you always come out on the bright side, because you always remember, in our world, we control the input so that the output can be something desirable for us. So at all times, the level of effort has to be the same. I mean, maybe in the bigger scheme of things, we'll commit more effort to it. But the moment we go always on the same level of intensity in every task. And I know it's oftentimes people like, this guy is smoking something that has expired. But honestly, but how can I give the same amount of time to the small impact, to something small, mundane, right? And the same for something that is very huge. But I'm telling you, it's the same principle that goes on in there, because the way we operate is oftentimes very systematic, very patterned in nature, especially when it comes to risk management. If you relax lackadaisical with the small thing, you can be rest assured you're going to be lackadaisical with the big stuff. So the amount of effort that you go with the small task, same amount of effort, even more when you get to the big stuff. Hope I've answered your question.
Yes, you did. So I'm going to get into my action items, my takeaways that I have been writing. You keep me honest. In no particular order.
Okay.
First thing, you always remember in the beginning, you always remember what you talked about at the end. What we just talked about is, in my mind, first action item is identifying an owner, identifying someone who will be responsible and accountable for the risk-aware culture creation. we're going off the assumption we're talking to small and medium businesses who don't have the resources for a risk counsel. Mm-hmm. So in that case, you know, who are we looking at? You identify a person. First off, we have to identify an owner. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty much the case with anything we do. Any implementation, any process improvement, anything, you identify an owner. Mm-hmm. And then the second action item takeaway I have is to map the network, map the supply chain. In so doing, identify your lifeline products, yes. Identify what needs to absolutely critical path, always get done, always get to customers, is going to keep the lights on. And I think that also will help with the analysis paralysis piece. You don't want to go into every single item you sell, every single thing you do, because then that is where we get into that 3-5 year, you know, plan of figuring out, you know, everything. So that's my second one. My third one is to understand, after you do that mapping, you've identified the owner, understand the level of effort and the time that it's going to take to do a real risk assessment. And this is just like initial. We're just starting off. The assumption is that you haven't done this in a long time, or you've never done this. But you want to take your supply chain maturity to the next level. Maybe you're scaling, you're growing. You want to make sure you're scaling intentionally and intelligently. So you need to understand the level of effort and the time it will take. And from that, you know, if you can do it yourself, or if you're going to call somebody who does it all damn day. You know what I mean? Like, this is what they do. This is the expert. And it's one of those things also where you weigh the cost benefit analysis, the opportunity cost. So we can put dollars on it, and people are going to say, I don't have the budget for that. I can't afford it. But can you afford not to do it? Because again, if we quantify the time that it's taking you to try to firefight instead of doing strategic growth activities, can you afford not to do it? You know, and it's also one of those things to where you can do it yourself, but should you do it yourself? If there are experts who can do it much faster and get you the information that you need to be able to action on it quicker.
Let me slip in one more thing. I know we're pretty out of time. If everything else fails for small businesses and mid-size, if you cannot do everything as we've kind of talked about in the last 40 minutes or so, develop a PACE plan. Develop a PACE plan, which is PACE. The primary, the alternate, the contingency, and emergency. If you can do that,
alternate, contingency,
emergency. If you can have all those four plans in play, if my primary doesn't work, I have an alternate. If my alternate doesn't work, I have a contingency plan. If a contingency plan doesn't work, then you have a, emergency plan. At least one of those 4 plans will work in getting your supplies. Or if I'm telling you, if everything else, if you cannot do everything we've talked about, if you can just at least implement those 4 plans in place in your business, you should be good to go.
Okay, cool. And then the last thing I have, and this is the time consumer, but really getting into that risk-aware culture. Yeah. Everybody knows what's going on. So the not time-consuming piece of it is maybe just developing a communication plan. You start there. If you start to share what the risks are, you start to share those PACE plans throughout the organization, you kind of start to get an idea. Everyone will understand, okay, this happened. This is why it's important. But the entire concept of developing a risk-aware culture, we know that is something that takes time. That's a whole other, maybe another show that we'll do a part 2 of the steps to developing truly a risk-aware culture. But I mean, I enjoyed having you. We had guest from India, Nigeria, staying up to hang out with us on a Friday evening. San Diego, getting up early as you are ready for your day, getting ready into the weekend. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Our next episode of Action Items, where we're going to be talking supply chain transformation, is going to be February 11th. We are going to be live the second Friday of every single month at 10 a.m. Eastern. So we look forward to seeing you next time, to joining us next time. If you have questions, comments, etc., you can leave them on the recording stream. If you would like to talk to Bio, Nicole, if you'll throw his contact information up. If you want supply chain risk management, supply chain networking, as he said, that's all he does all day. Call the expert, New Gen Architects. Hello at New Gen Architects if you want to get that discovery session scheduled, just to talk about your supply chain transformation and where you are going to be headed and how we can help. So thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.